Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
One of Australia's leading beer judges.
People always ask, how do you get involved in sake and how does that connect to music?
Because wine is an adventure.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
The prestigious title of Sake Samurai.
Looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way.
The difference between getting good quality fresh hops, it just translates straight through into the beer.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Our guest this episode is better known as an actor, but has had a winemaking career in parallel for the last 27 years. In 1993, Sam Neill founded the Two Paddocks wine company in Central Otago, New Zealand, an emerging hotspot for premium Pinot Noir. Sam has been a lover of Pinot Noir ever since he first tasted Burgundy in Europe in the 1970s. He spoke to me from Sydney prior to setting off for London to reprise his role as Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic World: Dominion, the sixth film in the Jurassic Park franchise. It's been a pivotal few years for Two Paddocks, which Sam tells us is now making the best wines it ever has, and is finally getting the respect he believes it deserves from critics. Settle in and enjoy our wide-ranging interview with Sam Neill, which is coming up right after this. What I love about Australian craft spirits is that our distillers are truly free to experiment. We aren't governed by rules and traditions. That's why the flavour and character of Australian spirits is so unique. But it takes distilling prowess and another critical ingredient to bring these products to market, and that ingredient is Bintani. Bintani supplies distillers with malts of all colours, flavours and aromas. They have a leading range of yeast and other ingredients, and the professional expertise to help distillers create the spirits of their dreams. Make Bintani your partner in taste and quality. Sam, you've been very active doing media for Two Paddocks in recent weeks. Is that simply because, for obvious reasons, you're more readily available to the business at the moment?
Well, we have gone through a very strange time, and normally I'd be at the farm at this time, and there's always 1,001 things to do there. And if it's not something to do with being out in the vineyard, I'd be in the office or with the animals. I mean, just there's 1,001 things. Gardening, my hands are full there. But I've been actually marooned, so to speak, in Sydney, which I have to say is no great burden. I love Sydney. But it has meant that, I've had more time on my hands and I've been able to do a bit of social media and so on. So I kept myself busy one way or another.
I've seen some of your wines achieving some quite big scores in recent times. Do you feel like Two Paddocks is currently making the best wine that it ever has?
I think that's absolutely right. The 18s are out now, and that was a really good vintage for us. There's a couple of things about that. Obviously, every vintage speaks for itself. But now all my vines are close to 20 years old. In fact, on 3 vineyards, they're older than that. So 20 years is the commonly accepted line in the sand for mature vines. These vines, they now know where they live and they're acclimatized. They talk about grapevines rather like they do about people. They're very delightful, but mercurial up to the age of about 10. And then they go through their teens and they become sort of sulky and moody and often brilliant, but not always. And then after about 20 years, they settle down into some kind of maturity, rather like humans. So I think that vine age is making for more consistency. We are more insulated against the vagaries of the seasons as a result. And I've been very happy with the last 4 or 5 vintages. They've been terrific.
And presumably you and your team have gotten to understand your vineyards better also.
Yes, and you spend your life growing your understanding of your own vineyards. In any given vineyard, there are always spots that stand out that are going to be brilliant. There are going to be parts that are problematic, and you work out how to work around that. And that's for a number of reasons. We have different clones of Pinot Noir in different parts of the vineyards, and some we've actually removed. That clone won't be happy in that particular space. Any vineyard, particularly in Central Otago, the soil changes every 10 meters or 20 meters. You'll be in bright yellow clay here, and you walk, you go for a 20-second walk, and suddenly you're in schisty soil or wind-blown loess. Things change all the time. Yeah, so we're learning more about our place, and the vineyards are learning more about us. It's a sort of two-way process.
Central Otago has been known for making a bigger, riper, richer style of Pinot Noir. Where does Two Paddocks fit within that?
Well, I've never been in favour of that big, bold style. That's not me at all. I've always encouraged understatement and restraint in all things, actually, including my wine. I think we're typical of Central Otago to the extent we tend to make bright, fresh, savoury wines, and they're in the red fruit spectrum as opposed to the dark red, plummy spectrum. You see, I came to Pinot via Burgundy, and Burgundy is all about elegance and restraint. We tend to perhaps pick a little bit earlier than others. I think we've always done that. We farm very carefully. We use oak very subtly. And of course, we're fully organic. And that takes a great deal of work and it's expensive to do, but I think it's worth it. And I think we make, as a result, very interesting wines that are also healthy. They're healthy to grow, because I don't use Roundup and all those sort of things that I really disapprove of. And I think that's reflected in the wine too. I think they're a tonic.
Your most recent vineyard acquisition was the Fusilier in the Bannockburn sub-region, which is right in what I understand they call the dress circle of Central Otago. Has that new vineyard, well, relatively new, been an important addition for your fruit sourcing?
I think it has. It's a really good vineyard. I think it's our biggest vineyard because it's 6 hectares, which is quite big for us. We have 4 very small vineyards. We've carefully converted it into organics, and I think we're producing beautiful wines. We're right next door to one of the more famous vineyards, which is Felton Road. We're right on the Felton Road, and we're their neighbours. And I've always liked their wines. I think it's probably helped in some ways in the perception of our wines, because it's a very sort of prestigious part of Central Otago. And our vineyards previously have always been on the margins. So the first vineyard is called the First Paddock. It's in Gibbston. That one I planted in 93, and at the other extreme end, there is the Last Chance, the first and the last. And the Last Chance is possibly certainly one of the most southerly vineyards in the world. And they're very different vineyards, but they're at the outer limits of Central Otago, not just geographically, but also in terms of their composition. The Last Chance is in a very arid, it's sort of perched high above a valley. The First Paddock is a much wetter site and cooler. In a great year, it is quite astonishing. In fairness, that's probably only 1 year in 3. So it's a very special vineyard, but very difficult. But the Fusilier is right in the center of things. And I did find early on that my wines weren't really taken as seriously as I would like, given the seriousness that we apply to things. And that's because I think we were at those really exciting peripherals. But now that we're right in the center of things, I think critics and writers and so on take us a little more seriously than they did before. But I'm very pleased that we are the only producer that has holdings in those 3 great Central Otago valleys, and vive la différence.
When you talk about not being taken as seriously as you would like for your winemaking, do you think your celebrity has played a part in that? Because I would imagine it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have the PR benefits of being a famous actor.
I think that's absolutely correct.
But that can also bring with it an element of cynicism among some people that maybe your wines aren't the real deal.
Yeah, I think that's a sort of prejudice that's taken a while to overcome. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there are so-called celebrities who put their names on labels and someone else makes the wine, or they buy a vineyard and it's a kind of vanity project. But I've been at this for 27 years now, and I've been seriously involved in every aspect of my winemaking. It's become the other half of my life, if you like. And there's also that tendency, I cop it, if I express a mild political view about something, I'll get shouted down from all quarters by people saying, what would he know? He's only an actor. So there is a tendency not to take actors terribly seriously for whatever reason. I actually take actors quite seriously because most actors I know are actually very bright people and very amusing and knowledgeable. And you've got to be smart to be a good actor. So I know a lot of smart people in the work that I do. But if they have another interest, like if they're a painter or if they're a winemaker or whatever it is, they will have to overcome certain prejudices to have whatever they do taken seriously.
I guess that's where blind tastings are quite helpful because those prejudices can't come into play.
That's certainly true. Now I'm getting 95 points from the Wine Spectator or 97 from James Suckling, these sort of things. So now finally, I think we're getting the recognition that we deserve.
I understand you've done quite a lot of work on the farm to bring back the native bird life.
Yeah, I love birds. And I'm also involved in various environmental causes. So it only makes sense that I would pay attention to the bird life on my property. And not all birds are the same, of course. We have a lot of problem with starlings and so on that want to, gorge themselves on our grapes. We have to net our grapes every year. But the native birds, which have been pushed out for one reason or another over the years, I was very keen to get those back. And I've spent a lot of time planting natives to attract the native birds back. And there were no native birds in the Farm Valley at all. But now we're seeing tuis and bellbirds and fantails, grey warblers, all kind of native birds that hadn't been seen in the valley for years. And they're slowly coming back. I go to a lot of trouble to grow honey trees so that there's something for them to eat during the long winter months. And we do have long winters there, long bitter winters. But that's been immensely rewarding. We saw a native pigeon the other day, a kereroo. But my whole approach there is an holistic one. We use biodynamic techniques. We're not religiously biodynamic. I have some doubts about Rudolf Steiner. He was by no means right about quite a number of things, but he had some very sensible ideas. And it's very important for me that it's a healthy place to live, a healthy place for my people to work. We have quite a few cattle. They're really there for the composting, for the manure. We have all kinds of poultry and sheep as well, not because they're there for the meat, although I love a good leg of lamb on a Sunday. They're there for weed control as much as anything. And we graze all these vineyards during the winter. Everything that we do there is a kind of holistic approach to wine growing. I have neighbors that spray everything with chemicals and so on, and I don't like going near them, and I don't particularly approve of their wines, even though it's a very troublesome business. Every vine on our vineyards is visited something like 14 or 15 times a year by a pair of hands. So it's not just hand harvested, but these are hand-grown wines. That's a lot of work.
You're obviously really dedicated to organic viticulture and putting environmental considerations first. Where did that ideology stem from?
That was a sort of slow dawning, really. And it started off, I had a holiday job when I was a student, and we were spraying gorse and other weeds around Southland with what was then the equivalent of something like Agent Orange. I think it was called Tordon. It was a terrible chemical, that just killed everything. You're supposed to wear masks and sort of hazard suits. And of course, none of us had that. So it's amazing I'm still alive, actually. But it was then that it struck me that conventional farming, there was something terribly wrong with it. If you can kill cabbages from 20 kilometers away, if the wind is right, you're not using something that's, it's very short-sighted. And the same thing struck me about agrochemicals. And I started to become interested in soil health. And it was actually quite difficult to establish our vineyards initially, organically. So we started conventionally and then gradually turned everything around so it's fully organic now. And it's been a long process, but a very rewarding one. And I'm much happier about what we do and what we make and what you drink as a result of that. And I think that my legacy really is going to be these vineyards. No one's going to remember the films that I've been in. There's such a turnover of actors and what we do that no one's going to remember that. But these vineyards that I've established, these 4 vineyards, will live on long after me. And I'd like to think that just as in Burgundy, people are growing wine on vineyards that were established by the Romans 2,000 years ago, then 2,000 years, if the planet is still alive, then these vineyards will still be famous in their own way.
You spoke earlier about your stylistic preferences for Pinot Noir. Does your winemaker, Dean Shaw, produce the Two Paddocks wines to your brief, or were your personal tastes both already aligned in that regard?
I think it's a combination, actually, because Dean and I have been making wine since 1999. We don't really have to talk a great deal about things anymore because he knows what I want. He knows what he should be doing, and he's really good. In addition to that, even before I was working with Dean, those first 2 vintages, I was using Larry McKenna from Escarpment Wines, who's Australian, incidentally. And Larry comes down 4 times a year and wanders around the vineyards with me and Mike, my viticulturist, and he's in the winery with Dean. And he's been absolutely fundamental to what we do as well. So Dean and I listen very carefully to what Larry has to say and value it. And I think that's all been, wonderful for us.
Many people of my generation are sadly unable to taste Burgundy because it's priced so far out of reach. How would you describe the stylistic differences in comparison to New World Pinot?
Yes, that's a difficult one. And it's very difficult to give descriptors to Pinot Noir at all because it is the most elusive of wines. I'm lucky in that I got to live in the UK for 10, 15 years. Back in the days when you could actually afford Pinot. That was before the Americans discovered it and the Japanese, and they're happy to spend a bit of money on a good bottle of wine. And now, sadly, it's become increasingly unaffordable for that reason. But when I first got to London in 1979, 1980, I could get a Grand Cru for 30 quid, or at least a Premier Cru for 20 quid. So I drank it on a regular basis because I realized I'd found something I'd profoundly fallen in love with. And that's what drew me to growing it when it was a marvelous discovery when I found that people were beginning to grow Pinot Noir in the area that I love most in the world. I built a house in Central Otago in 1987. And soon after that, about 1991, Pinots were beginning to become evident. There were 3 or 4 growers that were producing Pinots that were really interesting. And I thought, if they can do it, then why can't I? And that led me to planting my first grapes in 93. Yeah, it's a shame about Burgundy. Some of the greatest wines in the world come from there. Wines that absolutely fascinate me. But I think to get a bottle of Burgundy that is equivalent to, say, one of our single vineyards, you need to spend about $300 or more to get that kind of quality from Burgundy.
Do you have much of a cellar of wine at home?
I do. Every 3 or 4 years when I remember, I go and see my distributors who also distribute Burgundy, and I leave it to them, actually. I just say, I'd like 4 or 5 cases of Burgundy, of Pinots and the Chardonnays, and you choose, and I'll put them down. And then 10 years later, I'll wander down to the cellar and see what's doing well. the wonderful thing that we've discovered that we had no idea would be true was that our wines would age gracefully as well. I mean, it was always thought that New World Pinots drink them young, but that is actually not true. And it's kind of sad that very few of us actually have cellars. And it's important to cellar your wine well. It has to be the right temperature, and the humidity has to be right, and all that sort of thing. But 99.9% of us can't actually afford to have a proper cellar. So very little wine actually that we drink is cellared. But it's wonderful to pull out a 2010 Two Paddocks and see how it's evolved into something extraordinarily different. And the same is true of our Rieslings. And that was a big surprise to me, because I was really only growing Riesling, and about 10% of what we produce is Riesling. It's the only white we do. They also age. I don't know why I was surprised, really, because Riesling is a noble grape. And one of the things about noble grapes is that they are supposed to age, and they will if they're treated right. So our Rieslings develop into something completely different. Unfortunately, most wines, I think statistically, are actually drunk within 20 minutes of purchase. So we do make a point of actually cellaring our wines that will be sold later on. We have a wine club, and occasionally we will offer some older vintages to our members, and we get great feedback from that. And they will have been cellared properly.
So do your top-tier wines need further cellaring upon release?
We don't release them until we think they are, singing, so to speak. But if you can afford to do so, you will find it very rewarding to put them down even 5 years and see how they've evolved. I like the title of your podcast, because wine is an adventure. And one of the great adventures in wine is putting it down and being patient. Patience in all things.
This episode of Drinks Adventures is supported by Fever Tree Premium Mixers, the mixer of choice in the world's best bars and restaurants. Right now, I'm enjoying Fever Tree's Mediterranean tonic for a more delicate touch on some of the fine Australian gins you've heard discussed on the show. I heard you say that winemaking is the only thing you've ever formed any ambition for, which came as a surprise given the success that you've had with acting.
I never really had any ambition as an actor, and I still don't. It's always surprised me that I actually get work at all. And I hadn't imagined that I'd be able to have a career as an actor. That was a surprise in itself. So every time I get another job, I'm as surprised as the first job I ever got. I've never really wanted to be a movie star. I didn't see the value in that. I love working in movies, and I love being in them. I love working with movie people. But being a movie star, I can't think of anything worse, really. I mean, for instance, now I'm in central Sydney, and I'm perfectly able to go down and buy a coffee around the corner, and no one bothers me. But I've got friends, contemporaries, other actors who that would be very difficult. That need a bodyguard, or I don't know, all those trappings, all the nonsense that goes with being a star, I don't have to worry about. So I can live a perfectly normal life, and the same is true in New Zealand. I can muck around, I can go for a ride on my bike, and no one troubles me. So I count myself very lucky in that I've sort of got a good balance in my life. Nothing is too difficult. I'm successful enough for me, and that's been very good, and I feel very lucky. But with wine, it was different. When I opened that first bottle of my Pinot from that first vineyard, and I realized it was really good, about 5 minutes later, I realized that very good wasn't enough. I wanted it to be the very best. So those last 27 years have been about working towards absolute excellence, and everything we do is geared around that.
It seems to me that your wines have become more visible in Australia. Have you been expanding distribution over here?
We actually sell more wine. I mean, we don't make very much wine anyway. We're tiny, but we sell more in Australia than we do in New Zealand. But then it's a bigger market. We have a good profile here, and I'm very pleased to run into people who say, oh, look, I've been buying your wine for years and it's my wife's favorite and all that. So we've got a long, loyal following, and that gives me great satisfaction.
I heard you say recently that you're a huge fan of Australian Shiraz. Anything in particular that you've been enjoying at the moment?
Well, I bought a couple of bottles of Yalumba Signature a couple of weeks ago, and they were just magnificent. And the last bottle, which wasn't Pinot Noir, was something I opened last night, and it was a Sicilian wine from the slopes of Mount Etna. And I've no idea what the grapes are, but it was a very, very beautiful wine. Actually, I might just get the bottle, see if I can just hold your horses for a minute. Yeah, look, much and all as I'm a fan of Pinot Noir, it's really marvelous to discover someone else's wine that you just adore. I spent some time in Sicily. I had 2 or 3 weeks in Sicily last year, and I found some wines there that I thought were really good, but nothing as good as this. The producer seems to be someone called Girolamo Russo, and it's a vineyard called Calderara Sotana. So it's clearly volcanic, and it's like nothing else I've ever drunk, and I just thought it was fantastic.
Now, you're leaving to London next week to go and shoot. Are you looking forward to getting back to work?
I certainly am. I mean, it's going to be interesting. We are the first big film, I think, out of the blocks. They've sent me a 100-page document, which concerns all the protocols that we will work under. But I can't wait to get back to work, and I feel actually really fortunate because so many of my peers, of my fellow actors and so on, are unable to work at the moment. And I'm very, very concerned about that. Not just actors, but artists in general, and the arts have been abandoned, really. I don't know what the future is for the performing arts, really, because without an audience, I'm not quite sure what one does. So I'm very worried. And I'm also worried about the great institutions in this country, like the Sydney Theatre Company and the Melbourne Theatre Company and the Royal Australian Ballet. And what happens? Nobody knows. So I'm very fortunate to be actually able to go to work at all. I'm well aware of that. I suppose there's an element of being pioneers, anything can happen. But I'm confident that the studio will be doing everything in their power to keep everyone safe and keep the production on track. It'll be great to be with Jeff and Laura again, who are good friends. And Dawanda Wisek, who's someone I worked with last year. She's terrific. And then there's Chris and Bryce. I don't know them, but we've all been in contact, and we're all sort of a bit thrilled to get back with the dinosaurs because we've all been there before, and it's always been an enjoyable experience.
Do you see yourself continuing to do as much acting as you have been in the future?
I want to spend more time at the farm, and that's certainly my first priority once we finish the film, but we won't be done until October. I've just built myself a little house on the farm. I was previously living in what was an old seed shed, and it'd be lovely to be around during the building process, but that hasn't been possible. I always say, look, I'm not going to work this year. I'm just going to be on the farm for a year. And I might just do that. I've been thinking about documenting a year in the life of the farm and perhaps doing a book. That might be fun. And take a year off acting. I did that 2 or 3 years ago, and we did the James Cook documentary. I didn't act for a year. I spent that year either on the farm or in various parts of the Pacific, and that was a fantastic year. So I'd love to do that again. But, you never know. I always say these things, and then someone offers me a film in a place that I've never been before, and I think, oh, what the hell? That sounds like an adventure. Let's go.
I suppose you wouldn't do it if you weren't still enjoying it.
Yes, I wouldn't do it unless I loved it. And I love going to new places, meeting new actors, and being in the company of film people, of other actors. That's one of the best aspects of my life, actually. I've been very fortunate in that respect.
Well, Sam, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. It's been a really enjoyable chat, and I hope everything runs smoothly for you over in London.
Thank you, James. It's been fun for me too.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links, and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.